Dr. Megan Woods.
Chairman, and thank you for this opportunity to take a call on this natural resources section. Now, Mr Chairman, we've been hearing a great deal in this debate so far about the Department of Conservation. One would never think that the central piece of environmental legislation that could be discussed in this section is, of course, in tatters on the government's books. Because, Mr Chairman, this is a government that treats the environment with contempt. They've failed to keep our rivers clean, to protect our oceans from oil spills. They're lagging behind on setting climate change targets, and they want to pull apart the central and fundamental piece of environmental protection legislation that we have in this country, the Resource Management Act. But let's turn our thoughts briefly to the Department of Conservation that we've heard so much from the government members around. We're told that the Minister told us that she does not recognise the dock that has been described by the opposition in this House. Well, Mr Chairman, I suggest the Minister leave the centralised Wellington offices a little more often and get out to the regions where the cuts really have taken their toll and where the centralisation of resource into dock. If we have a look, if we turn our attention to the Department of Conservation report that we're considering here today, we can see that the very report we're considering says some areas of the department's work have been affected by staff shortages, including work with threatened species, processing permits and concession, and the management of huts. So the report that we're here discussing today even tells us that staff shortages within the Department of Conservation are biting, and that the department has had to increase its spending on travel, and that's not surprising given the concentration of resource and centralisation of resource into Wellington. So we've had a lot about the Battle of the Birds, and I think even from the chair of the Environment and the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, we're getting dangerously close to some kind of treatise about birds of the world unite, coming from the chairman there. We've heard a lot about wetlands and the work the Department of Conservation is doing in wetlands. Well, I implore this government to use the mechanism of a national policy statement that is open to it under the Resource Management Act and actually issue a national policy statement protecting our wetlands if we really are going to get serious about the protection of these areas, and that we're not just going to have easy and empty words offered in the House, that we'd actually like to see some action. Because, Mr Chairman, while listening to the government's words, it would be very hard sometimes to picture the kind of degradation that we are seeing in New Zealand. Because, Mr Chairman, 2/3 of our monitored rivers are not swimmable, according to World Health Organisation standards. And for me, that is not good enough. That is not the New Zealand I grew up in, and it is not the New Zealand that I want to grow old in. I think we all like to imagine that our rivers are there for our enjoyment and that we can swim in them. Having wadable rivers is simply not good enough, Mr Chairman, and it is not something that we should be content to accept in a country that prides itself on its clean green image, because we really do have to get serious. I want to turn the attention to the Resource Management Act, which is a central part of the Ministry for the Environment report. Of course, the Ministry for the Environment report being produced before the results of the Northland by-election were counted, and that in a fit of frenzy, the Prime Minister ripped up all the reforms that the Minister of the Environment had been working on, but we're told that the Minister is getting them in good shape. So I've got images of Nick Smith frantically out with the sellotape trying to put together what has been ripped up. Because, Mr Speaker, what everyone is fundamentally scared of is that this minister will do what the last Minister of the Environment in this government tried to do, and that is weaken our core protections of the environment that we have in the Act. The Resource Management Act needs to be cornerstone legislation. The Resource Management Act should not be something that you try and scrape through on one vote. And the loss in the Northland election showed the tatters this government is in. That the loss of one seat means that a central piece of legislation that they went to the ballot box last September on, that they're not going to be able to pass in this House, and it requires a fundamental fundamental rethink. Mr Chairman, I believe that when we're talking about cornerstone legislation, when we're talking about the very legislation that is there to offer the fundamental protections to our environment, that we should be looking to get some cross-party dialogue happening, Mr Chairman. That we should be looking to ensure, Mr Chairman.
Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. That we should be looking to ensure that we're not scraping by the barest of majorities, that we are having conversations, that we can actually see where there may be some consensus. I think there'd be very few people in this House or indeed in this country, and I know certainly in my city of Christchurch, that wouldn't think that actually having some considerations for natural hazards might be a good idea within the resource management. So I implore the Minister to actually show us what it is that he now wants to do with the Resource Management Act. What does he have in mind for Section 85 in terms of the private property rights? What is it that the Minister now wants to do with the resource management reform and we're told is coming? I also want to turn my attention to the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, which is of course another part of the suite of natural resources that is examined by the Local Government and Environment Select Committee. So the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has called on the Department of Conservation to speed up its classification of stewardship land, but this government continues to sit on its hand, and the new Minister for Conservation, Maggie Barry, has yet to do anything about this issue. So I would hope when reading these reports that's something that Maggie Barry will go and have a look and see that this is something that actually she does need to hurry up, to get some urgency behind that piece of work. We also heard from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment about the very important role that she will undertake under the Environmental Reporting Bill, which is due to be coming back to this House after being considered by the Select Committee. Now, Mr Chairman, it was with great sadness that the Labour Party weren't able to support this piece of legislation at its first reading, and that was for a very simple reason. That's because we saw that there was too much government control and not enough independence in deciding the topics that would be under consideration in this bill. And we hoped to get some change at Select Committee, and that wasn't there. But what was also very disturbing for me, that when the Parliamentary Commissioner came before us, and it's contained in the report that are contained in these volumes, is that we know that she has an increased function with this legislation, and she has some interim increased funding, but she under questioning, was able to tell the Select Committee that she's not going to be able to continue to carry out all that function with the current levels of funding that are there for her. Now, Mr Chairman, the function that the Parliamentary Commissioner has under this legislation is so critical, and I would hope that this would be listened to and that we would see some increased awareness around the need to properly resource the Parliamentary Commissioner to carry out that role. The other topic, of course, that underwrites all of the natural resources considerations is, of course, the very pressing issue of climate change. And we've heard a number of things in this. We know that New Zealand has to go to Paris at the end of this year. We also know that New Zealand, unlike many other countries, has yet to release its new target. And we're not sure, the Minister's still playing very coy with when it is that we will see our new target that we'll be taking to the Paris talks in December of this year. We were also told by Treasury at in the briefing to the incoming Minister of the immense costs that New Zealand is facing by not meeting its emission targets, that we're staring down the barrel of a deficit of anywhere between $3 and $52 billion by New Zealand missing its targets, that our emissions are rising, not decreasing. We are not going to meet the targets that have been set, and we don't see that there is enough action being taken, that we still have a government that has yet to do anything to fundamentally address the issue around the price of carbon, that we know that we're going to be looking at the emissions trading scheme legislation later this year, or we've been told, who knows, but something needs to be done, and we need to make sure that we've got the proper mechanisms in place. We need to do something to ensure that we're actually incentivising our foresters to plant forests that can act as carbon sinks, and in terms of carbon sequestration can play their vital role that needs to occur there, but we're not seeing from the action from the government that would lead this to happen. Because, Mr Chairman, climate change is real. just last week, that 272 workers in my electorate lost their jobs at the Sanford mussel processing plant. The reason that was given was the lack of supply of mussel spat, and the company put this down to rising sea temperatures and the inability to get that through. Climate change is not something that's happening in the future, and we can choose to ignore. This is getting real. This is about people's pay packets. This is about people's ability to get on and their families to make ends meet. Mr. Chairman, this is a government that has been woeful and is neglecting the environment. It needs to do more.